record. And let me tell you something, if when we come into our meetings, if I start talking about the content and I haven't recorded yet, or haven't indicated that I'm recording, if you remind me, I'll give you an extra credit point. So I went through like the whole hour presentation yesterday in my US history class, and then realized, and it was the Great Depression and the New Deal, which is really exhausting to teach right now. And then I realized I hadn't recorded it, and I was like, oh, I gotta go back and do all of that again. So if you help me, I'll help you, all right? Okay, so interesting stuff to talk about today. This is our world history class. You've got here our weekly discussion, and then you have a reflective journal. In this journal, because I know that a lot of you are overloaded with work and we're trying to navigate everything, I am just scaffolding our additional writing assignments to be part of your larger research paper. So instead of doing a journal that's reflective on like this content, I'm just asking you to explain to me where you are with your research. You can see this page, right? Reflection journal here. Okay, great, thank you. So it's due by Sunday. So just make sure that you answer these questions so I can see how your progress is going. Some of you I've talked to individually about your research papers, and some of you that I haven't. So just to make sure that I'm aware of what you're doing. And also these kind of assignments help keep you on task for getting your work done as well. Let me ask you a question. Did any of you enjoy any of the pretty weather the last 2 days?
I did.
You did? Nice, Abby. That must have been nice to be out in the fresh air after being in the hospital too, right?
Oh yeah.
None
Plus,
of the
I
rest
was
of you went
home
out
for a
there?
week.
What, Abby?
I was home for a week and I couldn't stand up because I didn't have enough blood to go to my head. So being outside was amazing.
I'm glad you had that experience. Anybody else get out and enjoy the weather? Celeste says yes. Will?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, for the past couple nights, we've been setting fires in the fire pit in my backyard. So.
Yeah, those fire pits. Any kind of like outside socializing kind of feels a little bit more normal. So that's good. Make sure you're doing those things for yourself. Okay, so I want to talk about revolution and resistance. And I gave you some different readings on like the revolutions that come out of the West that bring us into the end of slavery in Haiti. And also I asked you to read about the definitions of colonization by Shoemaker, who is a renowned indigenous historian, American historian. Yeah. And then also consider some resources on the gunpowder, not the gunpowder, but the opium wars. So let me pull this up here. Let me share my screen with you. You can see the slides?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good, good, good. Yeah. It's early morning routine again, trying to get into it. So we were talking last week about absolutism and the rise of absolutism. Does anybody remember how we defined that at all?
Absolutism was a new political idea that pretty much emphasized the power that the monarch had and de-emphasized the importance of nobles who were not the monarch.
Right, yeah, and we talk about when we look at the monarchy from this picture here, it's kind of blurry, but when I looked up like images of absolutism, it's all this like European, leadership, right? But we talked about the fact that absolutism is any form of government where the ruling figurehead tries to or maintains like this universal control. And so it's not a European phenomenon, but it does come up in Europe after the religious wars there. So, absolutism, this right of the, divine right of a king or queen or emperor or whatever, to dissolve all ranks of order underneath so that everyone is equal, or but all beneath that head, right? And so we talked about King Louis XIV and how this move to Versailles helped to kind of consolidate that power for him. But there's also an intolerance to absolutism that comes up. So the pendulum swing, you know, we could see that very clearly in our own political system, but especially like in Western cultures, we have this swing of political thought. And so when you swing too far to one direction, there's going to be a correction. And so when we look at absolutism and this whole organization of power that's centralized like that, the response to it is going to be to resist, right? And when you have resistance, you're going to have more pressure put on the people. So we could see this in China as well. When we look at the, I can't remember his name right now from last week. He was considered the Great, and he was the emperor who put into practice tolerance of religion. But soon afterwards, right, we see this restriction on religion, and we see the same thing occurring here in France. And what we see coming out of that is that there's this exodus of people, thousands of people who were in the businesses of trade and manufacturing. And so when the loss of this occurs, we're going to see a new discussion. Oh, my slide's too big. But the new discussion that comes up in the West is this understanding of the ideas of liberty, right, and liberalism, the founding of our own government here. The idea that there are these natural inalienable rights that no monarch or head of government has the right to trample upon. And so out of this resistance to absolutism comes this question of what is the role of government? Should the role of government be to create just social order for the protection of the interests of the elite, or should it be about the protections of the people? And I think we're seeing that kind of like struggle right now in our government, right? What is the role of the government in the middle of this, you know, global pandemic? You know, if you've been listening to or watching the news, Jared Kushner, for some reason, is in charge now of ventilators across the nation. I don't know. But he was, you know, making a statement that kind of really specifies this idea of like, what is control and who should have it, because he was saying, well, there's the federal government, us, there's the states versus that's them, right? And so that kind of struggle on who will maintain power plays out over and over again. And, you know, in the colonies, it's going to be the basis again for the revolution, the idea that sovereignty is within the people and not within a monarchy or a lineage of power. No hereditary ruling class, supposedly, but I'm gonna try to stop myself from speaking too much about current events here. But why do we have, you know, a son-in-law and a daughter and a son, right, of the president who are in these positions that just seem to be laid upon them? That really kind of violates the origins of the principles of liberalism as the founders saw it here. But these principles of enlightenment, right? The idea of revolution to protect the rights of people, it may spark off in the colonies and succeed, or helps them succeed in creating this independent nation. But the idea spreads through Europe. It comes back into the Caribbean. We see Bolivia, you know, becoming independent in the 1830s. So from 67, 74, whatever, through the 1840s, this ideology of independence, this ideology of the rights to our freedom of speech and the freedom of religion and the freedom of our own autonomy is going to create revolutions across the Western Hemisphere. And that colonial independence of the colonies for England, when England is basically by 1815, with the end of the War of 1812, when England is forced to completely, let go of its strongholds in the Americas, they turn their attention. Them and the Western cultures Western European powers are going to turn their attention to other places. They still want those resources, right? If the American hemisphere, the Western hemisphere, is not going to be accessible to them, they will turn their attention. They turn it, and we're going to look at this when we turn to the 19th century as well, or the 20th century as well, but the scramble for Africa. So what we see out of that is going to be the Opium Wars and the pressure of European powers for China to open up its doors. And so this is all kind of connected in this global scheme when we look at, the advancement of technology that allows for this maritime exploration of the Western European powers and what that means for colonization moving forward. That's why we have these different readings today to try to kind of connect these ideas. When we look at the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, 1776, Thomas Jefferson here, right, begins that assertion of the right of freedom by saying that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Of course, that's ignoring, whole parts of populations, right? It's ignoring the Atlantic slave trade and the millions of people who were forced into slavery here. It ignores the indigenous peoples who were on this land. So you've got a certain kind of colonialism that's coming with the enslavement of people. You've got another kind of colonialism that's coming with the eradication of the peoples who were here. And then you have another type of colonialism when you have the oppression of women as well occurring. So these ideas of enlightenment, these ideas of, we have these natural born protections, it's hype and circumstance for most people, right? I mean, by the time that the Constitution is ratified in 1787, only somewhere around 16 to 20% of the population could vote. And that's only white Protestant men who owned property. So it's an idea, right? And because the French had come in on the side of the colonies in defense and against the English, those ideas spark off in France as well, these same ideas. And there's similarities when it comes to the distaste for the crown that was in place, the American Revolution. The idea is, the English crown is taxing us and accessing these resources in which, we now live within, but we have no representation. That's another kind of colonialism. But in France, what you have is you have that first king, Louis XIV, the Sun King. We looked at him, right? And all the extravagance that he puts into establishing this absolute monarchy means that the millions of people who are under his reign are suffering. And by the time that you get 2 generations out with King Louis XVI, it's pretty much over. He's a very weak leader, and these Enlightenment ideals are spreading. And so you've got a system of order in France that looks somewhat like what we have here. You've got these 3 estates. You've got the elites, you've got the middle, and then you have the plebeians, right? And the first estate is made up of the clergy, about 100,000 people. The second is the noble people, 400,000. The rest of the population, 24 million, rests in the third estate, right? And so those aren't equal voices. If there's 3 branches or 3 voices, 3 votes, you can see that the religious group has the most power in that. And so what we were going to see in France around close to the turn of the 18th or the 19th century is a women's liberation movement that comes up, right? As children and people who are starving, women begin to organize their own voices there. And the declaration that comes out of France, this Declaration of the Right of Man and Citizens, right? Obviously influenced by these ideas of liberalism, proclaiming, equality for all. And again, when you have one vote, and one vote, it's not hard to see how an organized middle and lower class revolution might spark off on these ideas. And so, yeah, the king and queen are beheaded, right? This is the one and only time we see in modern Western Europe where the underclass will come up and basically slaughter the elites, who will then flee, right? And for a moment, there is this class revolution that is successful. But it's not going to last. Napoleon's going to come in, right, and create more uniform codes of law, and it's going to make him very popular as he's winning these wars, but of course he's going to fail at the end there. But what's interesting to me, because, you know, we've talked about how we don't want to spend too much time on European and US history in our world history class. We've gotten plenty of that. But what I think is interesting in the connections that I want to make to a larger global perspective is what happens with Haiti in all of this. Because this is a group that's exception to the rule, right? When the American Revolution is occurring, Haiti is under French control. And as I said, the French came in to help the separatists who were trying to fight for their independence from the English crown. And so you have these Haitian soldiers that are brought in, these gens de couleur libre, so liberated people of color who were in Haiti, come to fight side by side with the French and the rebelling groups here. They came out of Port-au-Prince, and they serve fighting against the British. In fact, they fought in Charleston, and when that battle was lost, the British seized these soldiers and then sold them into slavery. Now, not everyone was captured, but what happens is the Haitian soldiers have come to fight for this idea of U.S. independence. They take those philosophies back. They're still under French colonial power. There's, mixed race and blacks, and some are enslaved, some are free, and then there's like these white Europeans that are all in Haiti together. And what we see are leaders like Henry Christophe, who was a very young man. I think he was between like 14 and 16 when he came to the States, or to the colonies, to fight for independence. And he brought back his experience, right? There were these Haitian soldiers who brought back these ideas. And by 1783, there's a revolution occurring in Haiti for independence from France. And so what happens here is we've got this strong arm of interest from France, because you've got these colonies where you're getting the sugar and the coffee, which are some of the vices of European culture at the time. And so there's a resistance. But what happens is a slave rebellion, which again, much like the French Rebellion, is extremely bloody. The white Europeans that were in Haiti either escaped or slaughtered. Even people who were mixed race, biracial, they were slaughtered as well. And so what we see is from Haiti, an escape of these gens de couleur, those who were free, who owned slaves, and the white French into Louisiana, right? That's still also French territory. Haiti's going to become the first, Haiti's going to be the second nation in the Western Hemisphere to claim their independence from colonial rule. It's going to be the first and only slave or former slave population that does so. And they still pay for it today. Yeah, you just look at the economics there. Meanwhile, though, this Haitian Revolution sparks fear throughout the colonized Western Hemisphere. And so the transatlantic slave trade, as we discussed earlier, is going to close down, because who wants, those kind of influences coming here? You've got a slave population in Haiti that just slaughtered a bunch of people and got their independence. It's going to freak a lot of people out. And so the U.S. is going to establish the end of slave trade. They're also going to be coming in and taking over from Napoleon, a trade of Louisiana and all of the states that make up the middle, the heartland of the country. Meanwhile, though, the French have brought these slaves with them to Louisiana, to a place where there is still slavery. And so the largest slave rebellion that occurs in the Western Hemisphere, but for Haiti, is the German Coast Uprising. Something you don't hear about usually in U.S. history or in Western cultural conversations. But in 1811, more than 500 slaves take up arms, and they begin to march from plantation to plantation down the Mississippi River, burning and slaughtering people. And they are chanting death or freedom. Some of them, right, are actually in revolutionary soldier uniforms, right? They are led by Charles Delaron, and it's put down. This is not a successful rebellion, but there was hope that there would be an independent, African American state in Louisiana. Instead, the federal troops forced them back, slaughter them, right? And if you can believe this, they decapitate the leaders and put their heads on spikes up and down the Mississippi River. This is in order to ensure that no other slave group takes those ideas of liberalism, that all men and women should be created equal, right? And fight for their own independence. And so, what we see then at the end of it is that when people go back to look at the slave quarters where the leaders came out of, you find that there were copies of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man hidden in these slave quarters, right? And that some of those who were leading in this war were warriors from Ghana and other areas of Africa as well. So these ideas that we have, right, can spread. And it can be good, it can be bad, but they can spread. I would say, well, let me ask you, do you think that you can you think of any like more recent examples of like ideologies that have spread from nation to nation?
I mean, the thing that immediately comes to mind would be the Arab Spring in like the early 2010s.
Okay. Can you explain a little bit?
Just like the fact that there was kind of a wave through like Middle Eastern, Mediterranean countries of, wanting increased accountability for their leaders and, an increased interest in representation of, democracy and all of that. Basically that started in one country and then multiple other countries, the population realized, oh, we can, have these sorts of things if we stand up for ourselves. And it, was a literal wave in the spring, going from country to country of people, resisting government authority for a while.
Yeah, that's a really good example, right? This idea of revolution and resistance to oppression. And so, when we then turn our attentions and think about, and then in the 1820s, Bolivia is going to help to liberate parts of South America as well. So these ideas of rebellion continue on. But when we think about, the oppression of a system that affords space for people to organize, like David is talking about, right? And to spark off these ideas and rebellions, it's hard to kind of contain them when you have people who are communicating with each other and are able to, in a global society, see those connections, right? And identify with people and with struggles other places. So take a look here. I want you to think about this because now we're going into a more modern era. So in 1800, our largest urban areas, right, are Peking, London, Canton, look at this, Tokyo, Constantinople, right? Look at the shift by 1900. What kind of shift do we see here?
Very Western.
Very Western, right? It goes from more Eastern to very Western. And so as we talk about, world history, as much as we want to focus away from, the Western world, you can't do that when you get into the 1800s because the domination that comes from the industrial era, right, is going to be global. And, using the Opium Wars as an example of both resistance, right, colonialism, and the tactics used for Western imperialism, we get a better sense of what the world looked like in those struggles. So the second half of the 19th century, so we're talking about 1850 forward, we're talking about industrialization, the second industrial movement actually. And what that means is if you're not catching on at this point, if you haven't already gained access to this industrialism, then what we see is that there's more of a likelihood that there's going to be oppression, right? Because you've got these nations that have already weaponized through industrialism, and they're looking for new places since the Western Hemisphere is now being, lost to them as the United States, begins to create these policies of quote unquote protection, being the protector of the Western Hemisphere. You see these European countries turning their attention, like I said earlier, to places in which the Second Industrial Revolution did not lead to those technological advancements. So we're looking for raw materials here, right? Raw materials that can be manufactured into goods. And so India and China are going to suffer from this because although they had the strongest empires and the strongest nations and economies in the last century, that changes with the isolation, right? And then just the dominance that we see coming out. So did you read the article from Shoemaker on colonialism?
Yeah.
Did you get a chance to peek at that?
Yeah, I gave it a skim.
Gave it a skimmy skim? Okay, yeah. So Shoemaker is just trying to explain what colonialism is, right? Because usually when I think of colonialism in my Western scope, the first thing that I think about is, the Europeans coming and settling here. But colonialism, as Shoemaker defines it, is just any foreign intrusion or dominance. Not necessarily those who are just setting up shop to live and take over. There's differentiations here. She argues that settler colonialism, as we saw in the Americas, is just one form. There's settler colonialism, and she defines that as what we saw here with the English colonization, which was the eradication of indigenous peoples. There's planter colonialism, which is we see across the Americas, even in places where there was intermixing of people. Extractive colonialism, right, where a power has just the desire to access the resources. And I think it's interesting that she notes that this can also include a desire just to come in and take natural history specimens. Because we see archaeologists who go into Egypt, for instance, right, on behalf of the English throne and crown, and go into tombs, raid tombs, to put these, beautiful artifacts on display in English museums. That's a form of colonialism. It's also a form of cultural appropriation. So trade colonialism, right, where the metropole or the mother government gains access to the raw materials within a group or within an area, and then comes back with the manufactured items to sell to their own colonies. Trade is usually coercive, and the example that she uses there is the Opium War with China and opening up this additional trade. So if we look at the economic impact of this, right, what kind of colonialism do you think occurs then with the Opium Wars? What would you think? How would you define the colonialism there?
It's it's an economic control.
Definitely economic control. And based upon what Shoemaker defines as colonial, what kind of colonialism do you think it is under Shoemaker's definitions?
Extraction.
Absolutely extraction, right? Definitely, there is this desire to withdraw the natural materials because, if China, if people in China are becoming dependent on opium, Western Europeans are dependent on sugar and tea, right? And they're looking for those resources and places to get those resources. So there's an extraction of those natural resources solely for the benefit of Europeans. They're not taking the tea and the sugar and then manufacturing it into something else to bring back, right? So although there is an exchange going on, I would argue that the fact that the opium is being used as a device to weaken government, right, and to create dependency of China on European powers, I would say that that's extraction with, you know, manipulative tools of um, uh, addiction, right? Anybody else? You see any other kind of colonialism, or is that it?
Maybe transport.
Maybe transport, Chris says. Why do you say that?
Because from what I can remember, a bunch of countries started acting more on the both offense and defense. They started setting up hubs instead of free trade. In a sense, it became it's literal war. It's protect your own plot of land in a sense.
Good. Will, what do you think? Will? You don't have anything to share? That's surprising. No? He's looking back and forth. I finally saw your face. Okay, I'll leave you alone. I'll leave you alone. So, you know, what's going on here in China when we get to the Opium Wars is we have, you know, a weaker dynasty that's coming up. Those closed walls means that the technological advancements aren't really getting into China, and so there's still more of an antiquated system of economics going on in the country, and that with this but population boom means that the technology that would help to expand agriculture is not really there as well. So we have overpopulations, we have famine, and we have disease that's coming up, and this is going to leave open a weakening government to outside intrusion. And so the British come in, man, my slides are all messed up. And they begin to trade Indian opium for teas and silks. And like your readings mentioned, it's not as if opium did not exist before in China, right? It was used for medicinal purposes. But when you have a weakening government and you have people who are hungry, you know, addiction can rise. And so it was kind of like a perfect storm of unfortunate situations in China that open up this door. But there's resistance, right? China tries to end the trade. They try to fight back. But again, by this time, the advancements of industrialism are going to make it just very challenging for China to do so. And so there's a deep resentment that comes at the end of all of this, where, you know, China has lost their territory and control of trade, and that's going to have long-term effects. Here's the Treaty of Nanking here, and I found this article that I thought was kind of interesting. Can you read it? So I want to take a minute, and I'd like us to read it, and then I want us to discuss it. Let me know when you're done reading.
I'm all set.
Yeah, I finished reading. Yeah, I'm done reading.
Okay. So, when we examine these narratives of oppression, it's important to think about empowerment narratives and how we shift from victimization to empowerment. Sometimes it's not so easy to do, but I like to think about, what resistance looks like. So here we have this, consideration by, who's it? Yi San, right? One of the Chinese officials here. And what do you think about his argument? Just what do you think about it?
Well, it's very similar to the marijuana argument we had in this country a few years ago. He's suggesting legalizing opium to not only make it easier to control it, but also to provide a new source of income for the government. And that's pretty much, those two arguments were pretty much the crux of legalizing marijuana back when we were still having that debate.
Well, the debate's still going on in some places in this country, but yeah, definitely. The idea is if the money is going out, right, to this illegal trafficking, if we legalize it, then we can keep the money in the economy. And what's the second step here? What's the plan? Is the plan just to, have an opium economic system here in China?
Was it to tax it and make it more expensive, I think?
Okay, so one suggestion is if we have a legalized system in the country where people are growing their own, then we can tax it.
Yeah, it says, as the native opium will completely displace foreign opium in the domestic market in 30 or 40 years, we can then do whatever we please about the opium problem without involving either the treaties or the foreigners. Definitely, yeah, increasing control over the flow of opium in China was major priority with Yi San's and
So you've got this form of colonialism that's occurred here, right?
yeah.
Because now China is being forced to keep their trade open to a substance that they don't want their populations to be addicted to. So what we're seeing here in this conversation, in this idea, is ultimately, how do we address the colonialism that's occurred? How do we find a way to break this new power structure, right? If we have a treaty that forces us to keep our borders open to the addictive the addictive product that's keeping our people on their knees, then if we can shift where that power is, away from the colonizers back to our own system, we can once again have control over it, and we can end it there. It's like a 1-2 step, right? Legalize it so that we can keep our money here, right? And keep the source of it here. And then once we've done that, we can break the hold that these treaties have, and then we can eradicate the problem. Do you think that would have been an effective way to move forward? Do you think that might have worked? I don't like to, pontificate too long on what ifs, that lead us down into fiction, not what happened. But do you think this would have been effective?
I think there's a potential problem in that the native opium would need to at first be cheaper than the foreign opium, so people would move to it. But if they sort of slowly increase the price and taxation on it, like it seems like the plan was, people may have gone back to the foreign opium once the native opium had become more expensive.
Okay, that's a good point. Anybody else?
I feel like the European powers probably would have gotten upset over this and, come in and broken up whatever, the Chinese government was doing so that they would be reliant on Western opium again.
Yeah, I think that if I was able to grow my own, it's gonna be a lot cheaper for me, right? But I bet, yeah, I think David might be right on that. Like, once that became a detriment to the English, you might have seen that exertion of colonial power in a different way. So this is, I think, what we see with the Opium Wars and with this relationship between England and China is just a very clear non-Western, and when I say that, I mean just not England going to the west, but going to the east. I think it's a really good example of that colonial relationship turned to a perspective on the eastern part of the globe. So yeah, kind of scary stuff there. And then we see because of the impact of the limitations of industrialism in China that came from the earlier shutdown of those borders here, we see now these emerging powers and influences that are going to become part of the shifts in the political and economic and social psyche of China. So that's kind of where we go with that. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here. Next week, we talk about the industrialism that we've kind of touched upon today and the African scramble and what that looks like when, in 38 years, the entire interior of Africa, except for 2 places, but those places are on the coast. But, the entire interior of Africa is colonized. In 38 years, around the turn of the 20th century, and what that means, right? And the role of industrialism in all of this. Because again, it's important that we don't want to overhype the power of Western Europe because that sensationalizes and it kind of promotes that idea of like a superiority of culture and people. It's not that. Again, it's just access to these resources and to all of the information. As we've been talking about this whole time, these connections of cultural exchange that went across that continent, from China over to Africa and back. And all of that, kind of culminates into a location on the seaboard, right? And the groups that held power there were groups that had no problem going and slaughtering other people to, pursue capitalism in a Western construct. And so that's kind of where we find ourselves. But we'll be shifting our attention then to industrialism and the African scramble next. So what are your questions about what we've talked about today?
I don't have a question. Sorry, Abigail.
Oh, I don't have any questions.
Yeah, I don't really have any questions either.
No? Okay, well, we have some time. So before we go, I want to talk to you a little bit about your papers and see how it's all going. It's a chance for us to catch up. I know I talked to some of you last week, but how are you doing with your papers?
I haven't really had time to work on any bigger projects for any of my classes. I'm just like so busy doing the day-to-day stuff that I think I have to wait until like the weekend to get any actual work done on like bigger projects.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been hard for me.
Okay, that's fair. Has anybody run into any roadblocks or had any great successes with research?
I had to call in a book because it wasn't in the DC library, and this was a while ago before like the whole pandemic thing really kind of kicked into full gear. What should I do if I can't access material I may need because of the quarantine?
That's a really good question. The first thing that I would suggest that you do, if there's some information or resources that you feel you need that you can't access, is to reach out to the librarians. And the reason I say that is because they may be able to find for you, excuse me, they may be able to find for you an online version or something that's comparative. The librarians are skilled at research, and it's really one of their pleasures to try to find alternatives when something's not available. But they're also trained in kind of thinking that way. So if there's a topic in a book and the book is very specific and they can figure out what's in that book, they can probably help you piece together that content in an online fashion or or suggest something to you that's accessible. So that would be my first thought, right, is you talk to the librarians. And, you can also, if you reach out to librarians and you're having a hard time getting a hold of someone, you could CC me in. I don't think you will. Liza, Claire, and Tim are all home, and they're all working, and they love this kind of thing. But if there was something like that, I can get involved as well and help you get them, thinking about that, and also I can just help you find some things as well. And then my other thought on that, Will, is we do find ourselves in this moment of quarantine kind of limited, right? And what we can access. Can't just go into a library. Can't even interlibrary loan books because none of the libraries are open right now, which is what needs to be happening. But our library has opened up more databases. They're collecting more books that are online so that, our holdings are larger so that you have access to more resources. But sometimes, as a historian, the information is just not at your fingertips. And you still have to move forward and do what you can with what you have, right? I'll give you an example. This is one that makes me angry. So I was doing this road trip of research back in like 2007, and I was looking at state Supreme Court cases dealing with the issue of slavery and who is free and who is not, circa like 1840 to 1859, right? Very specific kind of cases I'm looking for, and I'm hitting all these different archives, and I get to South Carolina and I called these jerks up beforehand. I was like, you got all these boxes of like Supreme Court decisions from your state from this period of time. I can't wait to come and see them. I'm looking for this. I'm trying to like talk about, how people who were brown sometimes were considered white under these like, pretenses. And the curators, the archivists did not like that. And when I got there, I told you this story before, I got there and I was so excited and I filled out the first form and I'm like, ooh, boxes, right? Give me the first 3 boxes. And the lady goes in the back and then she comes back out and she's like, I'm sorry, dear, but Sherman Burnham. She's talking about the Civil War, right? And General Sherman, who had gone through, and she's telling me these documents that they have on their collections don't exist really because this white oppressor, right, this northern oppressor had come in and destroyed them. And I was like, what? And I had planned on staying there for like 3 or 4 days going through these archives. And every time I'd ask for something, Sherman Burnett. Can you believe 2007, this woman was telling me this? And I believed her, right? So I went ahead and I wrote the article without that information. I couldn't get access to it. Well, then I was talking to this African-American professor out of UMass, and I was telling him the story, and he was like, I think those collections probably are there. You just couldn't gain access to them. And it never dawned on me, right, that it was like racism towards me or towards my topic that might be the issue. But then I started thinking about it. You know how I had first tracked down those documents? Because there is these collections, Catterall, this woman back in like the 30s, went and collected all this information. And so there's excerpts about every case, every document, and all these archives of the South, right, that deal with slavery. So if it existed in 1930 when she went in there, I guess Sherman couldn't have burned them, huh? I'm just saying, sometimes even when you do your due diligence, you're just not going to get to the information. So what do? We make the best of what we have. It's the historian's lot in life, right? Chris, you got something to say? You got a question?
I would like to go back to the letter by the Chinese person who wrote about opium.
Okay.
And I think that he understands mildly how human behavior works, which is in cycles and moves up and down. But he assumes that, as Brandon said there, I think Brandon said, I don't know, that there would be no outside influence. He thought that it would work out perfectly if you added taxes or you increase the severity of the laws without any outside influence from the suppliers. Then there would be a decline in usage. He said if you wait over a period of time, which probably would be true, but people, when it comes to products and money, they work in cycles. It's a fad, then it's a decline, but then it's a fad again, maybe on something else. And the cycle isn't, it's not a sine wave where it's constant. It can go up, then just quickly dip and back down. And I think that's a problem he had seeing, because the letter was a bit emotional. He's like, oh, kind of hate the Westerns. They're going to wait for us to starve and look like skeletons.
Well, I think that, the situation was pretty dire.
Yeah.
Right? And you've got a imperial nation that has forced open, your borders. Again, China was lagging behind. They had not engaged in the second industrial revolution. So they're still practicing an economy that's 50, 60 years old, at least, in the moment in which maritime exploration has expanded and technology has expanded, right? So they don't have the economy set up to compete. And now they have this group that have come in, and they, even though they wanted to stop and block, the sale of opium, that is part of the agreement here, is that, England can still come in and bring in this drug. So, think about, what that would look like if, another country comes in with something that is, that is killing people. And those people are giving up the silver and giving up, the equity in the economy because of that addiction. We're talking about a severe addiction. I think that we want to be careful of bias, right? And it's a good point that there is emotion in there. But if you contextualize it, for me at least, I can give space to it because we're talking about trauma and horror and people who are starving in the streets. And Chris, we all want to feel empowered, right? Think about the situation that we're in right now. We manage our lives and our day-to-day in ways so that we can feel that we have control over something. If it's just going outside and, hanging out in a beautiful day, but we're still within these restrictions that we have here. But how do you feel empowered and knowing that control is an illusion, but that, we have to feel a sense of control over our lives? How do you do that when a dominating imperialistic country has come in and the agreement is they can feed into your system poison that's killing people as your economy has continued to be weakened?
Well, I don't know the population of China at that time, but like the person said, in time, it would go away. It would have catastrophic effects on the economy and the country as a whole, but you can't infinitely squeeze money out of somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a problem with just how money markets flows usually.
That's a problem with capitalism. That's a problem with, extraction colonialism, right? It's the idea that we can just tap. Why is it that the Western countries begin to colonize Africa and India to begin with? We haven't really gotten there yet. But the answer is that when you have this industrial revolution that occurs, you've got these new manufacturing powers, right? And capitalism is driven by product development and creation. And so if you've been forced out of the Americas and you no longer have access to those resources, you'll turn your attention to places that you can dominate, right? And those are gonna be brown and black places. And so you're going in there to get access to those resources. But those resources are not, infinite, as you point out. And so it's parasitic. And it's gonna continue to expand until finally we see decolonization occurring in mass out of the eastern part of the world during like the
1960s.
first half of the 1900s.
1960s after World War II.
Well, yeah, 1940s, 1960s. Yeah, what happens with the devastation of like World War II and World War I and World War II is that, now these European states are needing to focus on themselves again, right? And with the Great Depression in between there, it changes those power structures. There's a chance to push back. But, I think what's interesting about the article that we read is the fact that, even when you're on your knees, you're trying to find some solution. And if the best solution you can find is let people be addicted to their own crops so that we can at least retain the money we have, right? And then somehow, cut off this relationship, this governing relationship from this, metropole, we can then, once again, gain access to regulating the use of opium. But we can't regulate it until we have control again. And, you'd think the best case solution would be like, just tell people to quit doing it. But if you are in that you got to contextualize the moment of the economy that they find themselves in. If they were also engaging, if China had been engaging this whole time in industrialism, right? Then they would have, then England would not have had the ability to come in with their warships, right? And dominate on those ports as they did. So there's lots of different elements that lead to this moment for China. I don't even know if I answered your question or if you had a question. Sorry, it's early and this whole isolation is my mind sometimes. It's like Will said, it's like every day is the same. It's like sometimes I'm like, did I just say that? Maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm crazy. I don't know.
The reason I just say I use both the economic cycle and related it to human behavior is because it's kind of an instinct for pretty much all animals who find value in anything to participate in some form of capitalism, because we have to find value in something and find something less valuable, find our thing more valuable than another person, so we can feel that we have a better life than they do, which is why it's a problem with capitalism. It's a human behavior problem that won't go away.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you said about capitalism is true. I don't know that I agree that that capitalism is, I'm not sure you're saying this, but that's like, it's an inherent aspect of cultural and group greed, or the dynamics of the us versus them, but it does help to play that out. And the dominance of the economic cycle does help those who have that power, right, retain it and spread those systems, right, those capitalistic systems for their own gain. So in that, yeah, I definitely see where the spread of this, in capitalism has those outcomes. That's why it's always interesting to me when we talk about like U.S. culture and the idea of liberalism and the Bill of Rights and a representative republic where we vote in people to protect our interests, and yet this is a capitalistic state. And I'm still don't understand how those two are supposed to pair well. So thank you for that. That was a good little conversation. Chris, our economist in the room.
Basic. Very common.
What?
Basic level of understanding.
What else?
Do we know where, sorry. Do we know where Joe is?
I have not heard from Joe, but I can reach out to him to see what's going on. I hope he's okay, because, you know, he was working at the Dunkin' Donuts.
Yeah, he's just not doing the project. And Brandon, I don't know if you've done the project either.
Okay.
But that's, Brandon can get to it. I'm worried about Joe, though.
You're worried about Joe, just health-wise, huh?
Well, also, because I haven't heard any contact from him at all since we left GCC.
Well, he was in our class one day.
Was he?
I think that was the one before. It was like the optional one.
Yeah, that was just when we were just coming together, just to kind of see and
Oh,
discuss.
that was the 40-minute one.
Yeah. So he was here for
Okay.
that one. But I'll reach out to him and see what's going on. That's why I kind of wanted you all to go into your groups so that this week when I'm going back through all of that, I can see who's doing what and I can reach out. So
Okay,
I will do that,
thank you.
of course. Oh, you're worried about your buddy. That's sweet. We gotta take care of each other in this time. We do, you know? Any other thoughts or comments? Well, all right then. I guess with that, then we'll end a little bit early, but you know, as always, I'm here. So if you need me, let me know. You can text me. You know that. You've got my cell phone number now. And email. I have my office hours today at 11 to 1. Like I said, check online. You'll see more. And if you need anything, just reach out to me. You know, I care about you. My little heart, I care about you. I want you to be safe in this pandemic, right? Stay inside or in your yard, whatever it is. Make good decisions. Be kind to one another. It's, you know, I'm hearing stories of people being less than kind and patient with each other, which is hard. It's a hard time, but try your best to be kind and make good choices. Wash your hands like that, right? Yeah, like that. All right. All right, my friends. Well, be safe out there, and I'll see you in the discussion. Will, have a good day. Celeste, Yang Chen, Brandon, Chris, David, and Abby. Abby, you feel better. You take care of yourself. All right.
Thanks.
All right.
Okay.
I'll see you
Thank
all
you for
later.
class today.
Thank
for
you.
class today.
Yeah.
Bye, friends.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.